Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar overview of the program year 2018 Notice of Funding Opportunity for the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, HVRP, Incarcerated Veterans Transition Program, IVTP, and the Homeless Female Veterans and Homeless Veterans with Families Program, HFVVWF. My name is Cindy Borden. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. And through a cooperative agreement, we provide technical assistance to the HVR program for the Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Service. Before we get started on today's webinar, I have a few logistical things to review with everyone. First and foremost, as you may have noticed, all of the phone lines are muted for the webinar. You will not be able to submit any questions through the phone. You can submit questions through the question box in the GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar column tab on the right side of your screen. Questions will only be answered using exact language from the funding opportunity announcement, the FOA. Any unanswered questions and all technical questions should be emailed to Ashley Hoke, the Grants Management Specialist. Her email is on the screen. That's hoke.ashley.a@dol.gov. And the specifics for how those email questions should be submitted are included in the FOA. You must include reference to this funding opportunity announcement. The webinar is being recorded, so there will be a copy. It will be available for later viewing and listening. And there will also be a survey, post-webinar survey, that will come up immediately following the webinar on your screen. And it will also be sent in a follow-up email tomorrow, along with a link to the recording of this webinar. With that said, we're going to get started and move right ahead. Our agenda for today's webinar is we're going to start with an introduction to HVRP. Then we're going to talk about logistics and eligibility. We're going to go through an overview of the application, talk about the application process, the application review and award process, and then if there's time, we'll do questions. So, introduction to HVRP, the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. The Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, also known as HVRP, is authorized under USC Code 38, Sections 2021, 2021A, and 2023, subject to the availability of appropriations provided for such purposes. Excuse me. The Secretary of Labor shall conduct, directly or through grant or contract, such programs as the Secretary determines appropriate to provide job training, counseling, and placement services, including job readiness and literacy and skills training, to expedite the reintegration of homeless veterans into the labor force. HVRP is a competitive grant administered by the Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Service, also known as DOL Vets. HVRP is authorized under Section 2021. Section 2021A authorizes the Homeless Female Veterans and Homeless Veterans with Families Program, also known as HFVVWF, and Section 2023 authorizes the Incarcerated Veterans Transition Program, IVTP. For the purposes of this FOA and this call, I'm just going to refer to HVRP collectively. That covers all three programs, HVRP, HFVVWF, and IVTP. So the objectives of the HVRP program, there are two main program objectives for the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. First is to provide services to assist in reintegrating homeless veterans into meaningful employment within the labor force. And second, to stimulate the development of effective service delivery systems that will address the complex problems facing homeless veterans. Next is logistics and eligibility. So what is the FOA? FOA is the funding opportunity announcement. The FOA provides background information on the program, on the HVRP program. It identifies critical elements necessary for a responsive application. It describes both the requirements and the process for submitting an application, and it explains how grantees will be selected. So, the types of awards and amounts for the HVRP program. DOL Vets has a total amount of funding available of approximately $12 million. The maximum award amount for HVRP grants is $500,000, regardless of geographic location, that is urban or rural. There is no minimum award amount. The period of performance for this grant is July 1st, 2018 through June 30th, 2019. That is a 12-month grant period. And continuation of funding up to 2 option years may be awarded to grantees subject to the availability of appropriations. Eligibility. Page 4 of the FOA lists all the eligible organizations that can apply for HVRP funding. It's a very detailed list, so please go to page 4 of the FOA to see that list. However, there is a law that restricts eligibility for HVRP funding, Public Law 104-65, 2 U.S.C. 1611. Nonprofit entities that are incorporated under Internal Revenue Service Code Section 501c4 that engage in lobbying activities are not eligible to receive federal funds and grants. I repeat, that's 501c4 organizations. No activity, including awareness raising, advocacy activities, is allowed that may include fundraising for or lobbying of U.S., federal, state, and local governments. Next is the application screening criteria. To be considered responsive to this funding opportunity announcement, your application must meet all of the following requirements. First, the deadline for submission, no later than 4 p.m., so that's 4 p.m., 0 minutes, 0 seconds, Eastern Time on the closing date of the announcement. If it's submitted through grants.gov, and we'll talk about how it can be submitted a little bit later in the webinar, it must use the specified file formats listed in the FOA. The funding request cannot exceed $500,000. The organization must have an active SAM registration. We'll talk about that. It's the System for Awards Management. We'll talk about that in a minute. It must include a signed SF-424 form, and that SF-424 must include the Data Universal Numbering System, or DUNS number. You must include an SF-424A, your budget information form, and you must include a budget narrative. Again, to be considered responsive to this FOA, your application has to meet all of these requirements. You also need to meet the requirements listed on page 5 of the FOA, and that means you need to include a project narrative, an abstract, an intent to work collaboratively statement, and the competitive grants plan goals chart. If you do not meet all of these screening criteria, your application will not move forward through the merit review process. So let's take a minute to talk about the application priorities. The FOA identifies 3 priority areas for HVRP funding. The first priority area is the HVRP priority. The second priority area is the homeless female veterans, veterans with families priority, HFVVWF. And that priority is for applicants who are proposing to use 100% of the funds to serve homeless female veterans and veterans with families. Priority area number 3 is the IVTP priority area, and that is for applicants who are proposing to use 100% of their funds to serve incarcerated veterans. There will be no additional discussions before, during, or after competition regarding the priorities other than what's in the FOA. At least one award will be made in Priority 2 and Priority 3. So at least one award will be made in each of those areas. Organizations may submit multiple applications to serve the same service delivery area, provided that each application is for a different priority. I'm going to repeat that one more time. Organizations may submit multiple applications to serve the same service delivery area, provided that each application is for a different priority. The service delivery area is the area where the applicant is proposing to serve, as defined by the county, the parish, or independent city. An independent city is defined as a city or town that does not form part of another general purpose local government entity. Participant eligibility. Participants must be homeless veterans, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in just a moment. A veteran, they must be a veteran. A veteran is defined as a person who served in the active military and who was discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. Those who received a dishonorable discharge are not eligible for HVRP, HFVVWF, or IVTP services. Homeless, as we look at the definition of homeless, the definition of homeless includes persons who lack a fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence, persons living in supervised public or privately operated shelter designed to provide temporary living arrangements, an individual who resided in a shelter or place not meant for human habitation, and who is exiting an institution where he or she temporarily resided, and persons with a primary nighttime residence that is a public or private place not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings, and an individual or family who will imminently lose their housing, can identify no subsequent residence, and which lacks the resources or support networks needed to obtain other permanent housing. For the complete definition of homeless, please see pages 7 and 8 of the FOA or attachment A to the FOA, which includes definitions. Incarcerated veterans are veterans who have been convicted as adults and imprisoned under municipal, county, tribal, federal, or state law and fall into one of the following categories and need employment assistance. Category 1, the veteran was released within the previous 12 months from a penal institution into homelessness and needs employment assistance. Category 2, the veteran has been incarcerated for at least 6 months and is scheduled for release within 6 months with no known housing destination and needs employment assistance. Category 3, the veteran was released within the previous 12 months from a penal institution into temporary or permanent housing, but is now at imminent risk of homelessness and needs employment assistance. Or Category 4, the veteran is a resident of an institution that provides long-term care for mental illness and is scheduled for release with no known housing destination and needs employment assistance. Again, for further clarification on these definitions, please see pages 7 and 8 of the FOA and attachment A for the definition. Okay, now let's look at the application. There are 4 sections of your application. Section 1, the SF-424, which is the application for federal assistance. Section 2, your project budget. Please make sure your budget numbers are consistent. Section 3, the project narrative. which includes the statement of need, the expected outcomes and outputs, project design, organizational, administrative, and fiscal capacity, past performance, and then section 4, attachments to the project narrative. Now we're going to look at each of these sections in a little more detail. Section 1, Part 1, is the SF-424, the application for federal assistance. You need to include the catalog of federal domestic assistance number 17.805. You must have a data universal numbering system, DUNS number, and be registered with the System for Awards Management, also known as SAM. The links on the slide give you more information about how to make sure you have both a DUNS number and that you're registered with SAM. Part 2 of the application is the project budget. Make sure that your budget numbers match across all of your documents, across your submissions. That means the SF-424A and the project budget in Part 2. You will also need to include a budget narrative. This budget narrative is a detailed cost breakout of every item that you list in the SF-424A. I'm going to talk through each of these briefly, but for more information on the budget narrative, you can go to page 10 of the FOA, and it gives detailed information about each of these items. Your budget narrative will need to include information about personnel costs. That's listing staff positions by title, providing the annual salary of each position, the percentage of each position's time devoted to the project, the amount of each position's salary funded by the grant, and the total personnel cost for the period of performance. You also need to include fringe benefits and provide a breakdown of the amounts and percentages that comprise your fringe benefits costs, such as health insurance, FICA, retirement. Travel, you need to specify the purpose, mileage, per diem, estimated number of in-state and out-of-state trips, and other costs for each type of travel. Please make sure you use current federal mileage charge rates from gsa.gov. Equipment. The equipment category is only used for items that cost more than $5,000 per unit. Anything that costs less than $5,000 per unit should not be in equipment. It should go in the supplies category. In supplies, you're going to identify your categories of supplies, and you're going to list both the quantity of items and the cost per item in supplies. Contractual, this is where you identify proposed contracts with the purpose and the identified cost. If applicable, you identify any subrecipient agreements, including their purpose and identified cost. The construction line item, under this FOA, construction costs are not allowed, so this line item should be 0. The other category for your budget narrative is where you identify each item in detail for the reviewers to determine whether the costs are reasonable and allowable. This might include standout events, bus passes, incentives, anything that's not covered in one of the other line items. Your last category of your budget narrative are your indirect costs. If you choose to include them, you have 2 options that are outlined on page 11 of the FOA. And that involves either using a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or NICRA, or using a 10% de minimis rate. Again, that is detailed on page 11 of the FOA. Part 3 of your application is your project narrative. The project narrative is limited to 15 double-spaced pages. Any materials that go beyond that page limit, beyond 15 pages, will not be reviewed. Please carefully read each section of the project narrative and include all the required information. Make sure you use the same section headers that are listed in the FOA. And for those of you who were responding in the question box that we were stuck on slide 1, I hope that has been corrected now. I apologize for the technical difficulty there. So looking again a little bit further at your project narrative. The first section of the project narrative is your statement of need. Your statement of need is a complete and comprehensive narrative explaining the need for the HVRP program that you're applying for. There are 3 main areas that are covered in your project statement of need. The first is the area. So this is the specific delivery area that you propose to serve, including the county, parish, or independent city, the HUD Continuum of Care, COC name and number, and or the Native American tribal areas contained within the proposed service delivery area. Your second part of your statement of need is the need for your project. In cases where there are other HVRP grantees who are already serving homeless veterans in a proposed continuum of care, and you can find that in attachment E of the FOA, you must submit justification that an additional award is needed to serve the homeless veteran population. Your justification must include the COC name, COC number, PIT count for the COC, again, see attachment C to the FOA for the PIT counts, the remaining participants available to be served, and the reasons why another award enhances HVRP services already provided within the identified COC. You also need to talk about the market, the labor market conditions and employment trends in the area that you propose to serve as part of your statement of needs. The next area of your project narrative is your expected outcomes and outputs. This is your quantitative goals based on the population characteristics and labor market conditions in the area that you propose to serve. This includes your competitive grants plan goals chart, attachment B to the FOA, and that covers the critical performance indicators. There are 4 critical performance indicators for the HVRP program. First, the number of enrollments. Second, the overall placement rate, which is a calculation based on the number of exiters from your program. Third, the average hourly wage at placement. And fourth, the placement rate for chronically homeless veterans. You will need to set targets to set your goals in the competitive grants plan goals chart. The FOA includes this table about how to set targets for both urban areas and non-urban areas. Looking at this chart, you can see that for each of the 4 critical performance indicators, there is a target for both urban areas and for non-urban areas. Looking at cost per enrollment, this is used to determine the total enrollments for your project. The cost per enrollment values have been adjusted upward to reflect an 18% increase from program year 2016 median values to account for things like inflation and the anticipated increased intensity of services to participants who might be from harder to serve populations. You can see for urban areas, the target cost per enrollment is $2,290. And for non-urban areas, the target cost per enrollment is $2,992. This is to reflect the challenges that non-urban areas may have in serving participants. You can also see there is a target placement rate for both urban areas and non-urban areas, as well as a target for the average hourly wage. Those have been adjusted to account for inflation, and there is also a placement rate for chronically homeless veterans. These goals are targets, and you can learn more about the targets by looking directly at the FOA. The next part of your project narrative is your project design. And this is where you're going to describe your overall strategy for providing job-driven employment and training services through a client-centered case management approach. You're going to describe how your approach imparts relevant skills, connects participants to local employment opportunities that leads to improved employment outcomes and earnings. You're going to describe your support services with an emphasis on the special populations that you're serving. You're going to talk about the aspects of your approach, which include the population to be served, outreach and engagement efforts, intake assessment and case management, job-driven employment, training and support services, and the quality of linkages. We're going to go through each of these aspects in a little bit more detail. So first part of your project design is the population that you're going to be served. It must be an eligible veteran. There's a special emphasis in the FOA on serving subpopulations to include the chronically homeless, female homeless veterans with families, and incarcerated or recently incarcerated veterans. You must identify both the number and the percentage of individuals to be served from each of those target groups. If the subpopulation served of either the female homeless veteran and veterans with families or incarcerated veterans is less than 100%, the application will be reviewed under the HVRP category. The next part of your project design is outreach and engagement. And you're going to describe how your program will conduct effective outreach on a couple of different levels. First, veterans. So how will you meet your enrollment goals that you've established, that you've proposed? You're focusing on recruitment and engagement, especially with those target subpopulations. It will include how you will use stand-downs in your outreach efforts with veterans. You will need to describe your outreach and engagement approach that is flexible, persistent, and non-threatening. And you need to make sure you use evidence to support the outreach strategy that you're proposing. Outreach and engagement also includes your efforts to connect to employers and how you're going to promote active engagement with employers in your local community, and providing insight on the in-demand jobs and required skills for those jobs in the area that you're proposing to serve. And again, you need to use evidence to support the approach that you're outlining in your proposal. The next step in your project design, the next section, is the intake assessment and case management. And here you're going to describe your intake assessment and case management process. You need to include a couple of different things in this description. First, you need to demonstrate how you will determine a participant's readiness to enter employment following the receipt of services. That includes the use of information about their strengths, preferences, medical, social, and environmental issues, behavioral and cognitive status, The next section in the project design narrative is where you will describe how you will develop formal job-driven employment, training, and support services. Please note that a minimum of 80% of your participants must receive one or more training services. You can find a description of those training services on page 17 of the FOA. You need to include a description of your assessment process, how you will assess employment readiness amongst participants. You will also discuss the individual employment plan, how you will form a plan, and how you will engage in case management to help participants achieve that plan. You also need to make sure you include a description of your partnership with your local American Job Center or job centers. You also need to describe the supportive services that you will provide or refer your veterans to overcome their barriers to employment. That includes a housing assistance strategy, but also provision or referral to other services. And again, stressing again that you have to provide evidence to support the approach that you are proposing to use. Job-driven employment training and support services, a little bit more on this. You need to make sure that you are focusing on in-demand jobs in your local labor market and imparting the skills that align to those jobs. So you are targeting your training to local employment opportunities, and that training leads to improvement in employment and earnings over time. You're describing the types of support services that you are providing or referring to, and what your approach is to providing those services. That you are providing or referring participants to a spectrum of employment services, and that you are co-enrolling all participants with the American Job Centers for additional employment services, up to and including job placement. The next section of your project narrative is your quality of linkages. The quality of linkages answers the question, how will you partner and coordinate to establish a network of service linkages for your participants? Your description must include evidence to support that the proposed network of housing assistance, healthcare, and other supportive services and the linkages that you provide will enable the participants, that will enable you to successfully provide employment and training services to your participants. All HVRP programs should partner with the supportive services for veteran families, SSVF, and HUD Continuum of Care programs, given the availability of these programs in the proposed service delivery area. Next is the organizational, administrative, and fiscal capacity. This is where you're going to describe your organization's ability to manage a federal grant. That means the operational, administrative, programmatic, and financial reporting requirements. It also is where you demonstrate that you have the fiscal and administrative controls to properly manage federal funds. And this is also where you're going to describe your key staff, their skills, their experience, their knowledge, their qualifications, where your office locations will be, where you will provide services, and you can also provide an organizational chart in this section. Next is past performance. So for past performance, there are two possibilities. First, we're going to talk about applicants who are previous HVRP grantees, and then I'll talk for a minute about applicants with no HVRP grantee experience. For previous HVRP grantees, you must include the planned and actual performance outcomes from the last and most recent completed year technical performance report, TPR, and plan goals chart. Again, you must include the planned and actual performance outcomes from the last or most recent completed year technical performance report and plan goals chart. For applicants who do not have HVRP experience, you must include a list of no more than 3 comparable federal or non-federally funded agreements and explain how operating those comparable programs has prepared you to operate HVRP. And you need to describe how long the comparable program has been in operation. Part 4 of the application is the attachments to the project narrative. Please follow the directions in the FOA. Do not include letters of support. You need to submit an abstract consisting of a 1-page overview and a chart. Applicants are encouraged to use a single chart that provides the requested information, and I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. And page 22 of the FOA also provides an example of that chart. So if you look here, this is a sample of the chart that would be included as part of the abstract, and you can see it has the applicant name, the legal name of your organization, the proposed priority area, HVRP, HFVVWF, or IVTP, as we discussed earlier, the service delivery area, the congressional districts to be served, the project type, either urban or non-urban, the number of homeless veterans to be served, the total cost per participant, the average hourly wage at placement, these are from your plan goals chart, the continuum of care to be served, and that includes both the name and the number of the COC that you're going to be serving, the special population groups and percentages of the total veterans planned to be served that make up those special population groups, key partnerships with other federal, state, or local programs, and that includes, for example, the Supportive Services for Veteran Families Program, SSVF grantees, the Grant and Per Diem, GPD grantees, HUD-VASH, the HUD and VA Supportive Housing Program, the Veterans Affairs Community Employment Coordinators, CEC, faith-based organizations, and other community resources. It also includes credentials that might be earned, so certifications, degrees, licenses, etc., that may be earned through your program, and targeted industries and jobs for your HVRP program. Okay, and next we're going to spend a couple of minutes to talk about the application process for HVRP funding. The application submission. All applications are due no later than 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the closing date of the announcement. That is May 7th, 2018, and you can see that in the FOA. And that is 4 p.m. on the dot. As you can see, it's 4:00:00, so 4 p.m. with 0 seconds. There are 2 acceptable methods to submit your application. You can submit it electronically at grants.gov, and there's a link there on the slide, or you can submit it by hard copy, and that is either by mail or hand delivering, which hand delivering includes overnight delivery. Unacceptable methods of submission are email, telegram, or by fax. If you are mailing your application, so that is if you are submitting a hard copy application for HVRP funding, you must submit the hard copy, but you also must include in your hard copy submission an identical electronic copy of the application on CD or flash drive. The hard copy must be copy ready, which means there are no tabs, staples, anything like that to ease copying. And the address for mailing that hard copy is here on the slide and is included in the FOA as well. If you are going to submit your application electronically through grants.gov, there's no need for copies. Be aware that the registration process that we talked about earlier, getting both your DUNS number and your SAM registration, can take up to 4 weeks. So please allow time for that. There is a downloadable registration guide available on grants.gov. When you submit your application through grants.gov, there are 2 email responses that you receive. The first one confirms receipt of your submission and provides a tracking number. The second one confirms that your application was accepted or rejected because of errors or validation. So the first one is going to say we've received, it confirms receipt and gives you a tracking number. The second one will confirm whether it has been accepted or whether it's rejected due to errors. You need to comply with all the submission requirements outlined in the FOA, and I encourage you to read this section. It does talk about time lag between that first confirmation receipt email and when you get that validation email, and allow yourself time for that if you're applying electronically. Next, we have a little bit to talk about the application review process and how awards are made. So this is a summary of the criteria and the point values that are going to be used to evaluate each of the applications. You can see here, there's a list of the criterion and then the maximum number of points. For the statement of need that we talked about, there's a total maximum of 17 points that an application can receive. The expected outcomes and output section has a total maximum of 12 points. The project design section has a total possible of 38 points. The organizational, administrative, and fiscal capacity section is worth a total of 12 points. The past performance section is worth a total of 12 points. And the budget and budget narrative are worth a total of up to 9 points, giving a maximum of 100 points for an application. This slide provides an example of the scoring model that will be used by the review panels. For each of the criterion, there is the FOA outlines the elements of responsiveness and a scale for scoring. So for each of those criterion, in the FOA, you will see a similar scale like this one. This example is talking about the intake assessment and case management process and evaluating whether it would result in eligible homeless veterans reintegrating into the workforce. This particular example has a maximum of 9 points, and you can see that there are 3 different elements that it's being evaluated on. The first is clarity, and it can be awarded from 0 to 3 points for clarity, which is how clearly the proposal describes the intake assessment and case management process. The second area is persuasiveness. So how persuasive is it in demonstrating the utility of that process? And the third category is evidence. How much evidence is used to support that process works, either from evidence or promising practices or from the organization's experience using that strategy. This is just a sample, but for each of the criteria, the FOA lays out a similar scale that will be used by the evaluators to evaluate the proposals. In addition to that criteria, it's important to note that the grant officer reserves the right to make selections based on the final scores of the process and will take into consideration the geographic distribution of funds in accordance with need as demonstrated by the HUD point-in-time count within the proposed continuum of care. Again, you can see attachment C for the 2017 point-in-time counts by COC. The grant officer may consider any other information that comes to his or her attention. The government may elect to award the grants with or without discussions with the applicant. Should a grant be awarded without discussions, the award will be based on the applicant's signature on the SF-424, including electronic signature by e-authentication on grants.gov, which constitutes a binding offer by the applicant. Award notices. Applicants selected for HVRP funding will be contacted directly. If you are not selected, you will receive an email or mail notification. Authorized officials from your organization may request a written debriefing on their application weaknesses, and award notifications will be posted on the VETS homepage, www.dol.gov/vets. I'm going to pause for just a minute and see what questions we have. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties earlier. We will post all of the slides. They will be available along with the recording, since we did have a challenge at the beginning there with some of the slides not showing up. And just to clarify again, the webinar has been recorded and it will be available for listening and viewing again later. Give me just a minute, I'm looking through questions. There is a question about funding amounts. Again, the maximum award under HVRP, under this FOA for HVRP, is $500,000. There is no minimum award amount. There's a question about if you are serving both urban and non-urban counties. Please look at the FOA. There is information about how to proceed in that instance, and it is based on what percentage of the population you're expecting to be served will be in urban areas or in non-urban areas. So please review that distinction in the FOA. There is a question around definitions of enrolled and participants. Again, I would point you to attachment A, which is the definitions attachment to the FOA. All definitions are included in attachment A. If you have questions about definitions, please refer to that attachment. I see a question around letters of support. Per the FOA, do not include letters of support. Please look directly at the language in the FOA. You do not need to include, and you should not include, letters of support. There's a question about the number of pages for the project narrative. That is 15, 1-5 is the page limit for the project narrative. There is a question about attachments and which attachments are and are not included in part of the 15 pages. Please look back at the FOA. There, it describes in the attachment section which what is included as part of your 15 pages and what is not included. And if you give me a minute, I'm going to be able to tell you what page that is. I see a question around the targets for both urban and non-urban grantees for the 4 critical indicators. Again, and the question is around those targets and can you propose higher or lower amounts than those targets? In the FOA, that question is answered, and excuse me, I'm looking for a page number. The FOA does say those are targets, and that's where you should start, but that you, depending on the population served, you may make adjustments to those amounts if you justify the reason for changing those target goals. And again, those are targets, and the direct language is available in the FOA itself. There are a couple of questions around the definition of most recent program year for previous HVRP grantees who need to submit their past performance for the most recent program year. Please refer that question directly to Ashley Hope. Her email address is listed on the screen. Let's see. I think that's all of the questions that we can answer directly from the FOA. I encourage anyone who has additional questions or whose questions weren't answered to email Ashley. Her email address is on the screen. You can see it there. It's hoax.ashley.a@dol.gov. Per the FOA, please include a reference to the HVRP funding opportunity announcement in your email with your technical question, and you also need to include some contact information for yourself, and that's all outlined in the FOA itself. I'm going to wait just another moment to see if there are any additional questions that we can answer today. We have a question about whether attending this meeting is required to apply for the grant, and the answer to that is no. There is no requirement to listen to the webinar in order to apply for the grant. Okay, so those are all the questions that we had for today. Again, any questions that were unanswered or that you need clarification on, please email Ashley Hope directly at her email address listed. Thank you for joining us today. The webinar recording will be available within 24 hours, as will a copy of the PowerPoint slides. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a great day.